I still remember the day I closed on that house like it was burned into my memory in a way I didn't expect it to be. It was early summer 2019, one of those oddly bright mornings where everything feels like it's going to be simple for a long time. The place wasn't anything impressive from the outside, just a two-story home sitting on a quiet street in a small suburban pocket outside Cedar Hollow. But what sold me wasn't the house itself. It was the backyard, not huge, not extravagant, just enough space where you could actually breathe, where you could step outside and feel like nobody was right on top of you. And after years of apartment living that matter more than anything else, I remember going over every detail before signing, like I would try to protect my future self from regret. I checked the survey maps twice, walked the property line with the inspector, looked for the boundary pins myself, even though he told me it was all already verified. I just needed to see it with my own eyes. Those little metal markers in the ground that basically say this is where your world ends and someone else's begins. And once I was satisfied, I told myself, all right, this is it. This is finally a place where nothing complicated is supposed to happen. And for a long time, that was actually true. The first couple of years were exactly what you hope for when you buy a home. Quiet mornings with coffee on the back step, mowing the lawn on weekends with no rush, sitting outside at night, just listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes I just stand there looking at the yard thinking how rare it is to have something in life that doesn't demand anything from you. But that kind of peace has a way of making you forget how fragile it actually is, because in early 2024, everything started to shift without warning. The house behind mine got sold, and a new neighbor moved in. His name was Ryan Keller, early 30s. Came off friendly in that very specific neighborly way, where you can't tell if it's genuine or just social strategy. He introduced himself over the fence one afternoon while I was outside, said he worked in property development, that he liked improving old spaces, and he mentioned almost casually that he was planning a renovation. Nothing extreme at first, just expanding the second floor, modernizing the structure, and adding a balcony so he could open up the view. I remember nodding along thinking it didn't really involve me, because why would? It was his house, his project, and I wasn't the kind of person who interferes in other people's upgrades. But looking back now, that conversation was the first crack. Construction started a few weeks later, and at first it felt like every other renovation you hear in a neighborhood. Trucks in the morning, workers moving materials, hammering, saws, the usual noise that becomes background after a while. I even try to be understanding about it, because that's just part of living near other people. But then small things started to feel off in a way I couldn't ignore. The framing for the second floor looked slightly too close to my side, like the geometry of the structure was leaning in a direction it shouldn't have been. I told myself I was probably just overanalyzing it. Angles can be misleading from the ground, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions without proof. But one afternoon I was outside grilling, and I looked up at the progress, and something in my stomach tightened, because the balcony frame wasn't just close, it was extending past what I understood to be his property line. Not just visually overlapping, but physically projecting into the airspace above my backyard. I stood there for a while trying to rationalize it, telling myself there's no way someone would actually build something like that without checking. So I walked over to the construction site, and I asked one of the workers directly, pretty casually at first, like I was expecting a simple explanation that would make me feel stupid for even asking, but he barely looked up and just said they were following the homeowner's plans, like that settled everything. No concern, no hesitation, just execution. And that was the moment it stopped being a vague feeling and turned into something real enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I went to Ryan's house, I knocked. And when he opened the door, he had this calm, relaxed expression, like it was just another friendly neighbor conversation. I told him, straight, your balcony is extending over my property line. I wasn't emotional at that point, just direct, and I expected at least some surprise, some pause, but instead he smiled like I had misunderstood something basic. He leaned on the door frame and said it's just a small overhang. It's not touching your land. It's not a big deal. I remember that sentence almost word for word because of how casually it dismissed everything I thought was obvious. I told him it doesn't matter whether it touches the ground or not. It's still my airspace. My property boundary is still my property boundary. And that's when he gave this small dismissive laugh and said, it's only a couple feet. Nobody cares about airspace like that. Don't overthink it. I walked back home feeling that strange mix of disbelief and irritation where your brain keeps trying to find the joke, but there isn't one. That night, I pulled out all my original documents, Survey papers, closing records, boundary maps, spread them across. My kitchen table under a bright light, like I was preparing a case. I never thought I'd have to prepare, and the next morning I went outside and physically checked the boundary pins again, carefully measuring distances, taking photos from multiple angles, standing in different spots, just to make sure I wasn't misreading perspective, and there it was clear enough that I couldn't pretend otherwise. The balcony structure was extending roughly 3 feet into the space above my backyard. Not a misunderstanding, not a visual trick, a real encroachment. And that was the first moment I felt something shift from annoyance into something heavier, because once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. So I called a licensed surveyor. And when he arrived, I remember standing there with him in silence as he worked, watching him place markers along the ground, measure carefully, double-check readings. And then he stepped back and said in a very calm, professional tone that yes, this is a confirmed encroachment approximately 3 feet over the boundary line into your airspace. And hearing it stated like that officially turned everything from personal frustration into documented fact. That word stuck with me longer than I expected, encroachment, because it sounded final, like something already out of your control unless you act on it immediately. That same day, I contacted a real estate attorney in town, sent him everything I had, photos, survey results, timeline of construction, and his response was immediate and very matter of fact. He said, "This isn't a gray area. It's a clear violation of property rights. We're going to issue a formal notice and stop this before it becomes permanent." So we did. A certified letter went out demanding immediate cessation of construction and removal of anything crossing the boundary line. And at that point, I honestly thought that would be enough to correct it. Maybe a difficult conversation, maybe some awkwardness with a neighbor, but a fixable situation. I didn't expect what came next, because Ryan didn't respond. Not even a phone call, not even a conversation. Construction continued exactly as before, like the letter had never existed at all. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't going to resolve itself through normal cooperation, and that whatever came next was going to be a lot more serious than I originally thought. After the certified letter went ignored, something in the atmosphere of the whole situation just changed for me. Not in a dramatic way. More like a slow realization that I was no longer dealing with someone who was confused or misinformed. I was dealing with someone who had already made a decision and wasn't planning to reverse it. Construction didn't slow down. It actually intensified, like there was a quiet urgency behind it now. Every morning I'd hear the trucks arriving earlier than before. That deep engine rumble and the reversing alarms echoing between the houses. And it started to feel like my backyard had a schedule I didn't agree to but couldn't avoid. I'd stand in my kitchen sometimes just watching through the window, coffee in hand, try to convince myself there was still a chance this was all going to be corrected without escalation. But every day the structure looked more permanent, more committed, more real. The balcony frame started to take shape fully. And the part that bothered me most wasn't just that it was close to my property. It was that it was clearly extending beyond it, like a physical declaration that the boundary didn't matter as much as the design they wanted to achieve. One afternoon, I went outside and stood directly beneath it. And I remember that moment very clearly because it felt different standing under it rather than just looking at it from a distance. From below, you could really see it. The overhang casting a shadow across my yard, even in full daylight. And it gave the whole thing a weight it didn't have when you were just observing it casually. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was physical intrusion. So I went back to Ryan again, and this time I wasn't as patient. I told him I had the surveyor's confirmation, official documentation, clear evidence of a 3-foot encroachment, and he didn't react the way most people would when confronted with that kind of certainty. There was no shock, no apology, just this slightly annoyed expression like I was interrupting his progress. He crossed his arms and said, "It's an overhang, not a structure on your land. It doesn't change anything." And I remember just exhaling and shaking my head because that logic didn't even attempt to engage with reality. I told him directly that airspace is legally protected, that property lines extend vertically, not just on the ground. And for the first time I saw a shift in his expression, not concern, not realization, but irritation. Like the conversation itself had become inconvenient. He said something. Like, I'm not stopping construction at this point. It's already too far along. And then he just turned and went back inside like the discussion was over. That was the moment I understood that polite conversation wasn't going to resolve anything here. So I stopped trying to rely on informal steps and went fully procedural. I hired a second licensed surveyor, not because I doubted the first one, but because I needed something no one could dismiss, something airtight. And when he came out, he worked with even more precision, using updated equipment, marking the boundary clearly with visible flags, and recording everything in formal documentation. And he gave me the same conclusion, but in even more definitive language. Yes, there is a clear encroachment into your property's airspace, approximately 3 feet, and it is structurally significant. I took that report straight to my attorney. And that's when the tone of everything shifted completely from dispute to case. My lawyer told me we were no longer in a conversation phase. We were now in enforcement territory. He prepared a formal escalation notice, stricter language, deadlines, legal consequences clearly outlined. And I remember him saying something that stuck with me, that once someone continues construction after verified notice of encroachment, it stops being a misunderstanding in the eyes of the court. It becomes intentional conduct. And that was the line where everything started to harden into something irreversible. Because Ryan didn't just ignore the second notice, he doubled down. Construction continued at full pace. Workers were finishing sections of the balcony as if nothing had changed legally or otherwise. And that's when my attorney moved forward with filing. The case itself wasn't complicated in structure. Property law in this situation is actually very straightforward. But what made it stronger was the timeline, because now we weren't just proving encroachment, we were proving awareness. And during discovery, something came out that changed the entire weight of the case. The contractor admitted that during framing, they had identified the boundary issue. They had flagged it internally, but Ryan had instructed them to proceed regardless because redesigning would delay the project and increase costs. And hearing that later, I realized that this had never been about confusion or oversight. It was a deliberate choice made with full awareness of the risk, and that changed how I saw everything that had happened up to that point, because suddenly all those small dismissive moments weren't misunderstandings anymore. They were decisions stacked on top of each other. And while all of this was unfolding legally, life outside the dispute kept moving in this strange parallel rhythm. I'd still go outside in the evenings, still walk through my backyard, but the feeling had changed. There was always that structure above me now, always that reminder that someone else had extended their plans into my space without permission. And I'll be honest, there were moments I questioned whether continuing was worth it, because legal processes are slow, draining, and emotionally exhausting in ways people don't talk about. But every time I considered stepping back, I'd think about that first time standing underneath the balcony shadow in my own yard, and it would bring everything back into focus. So I stayed in it. And eventually the case reached its final stage, and I knew we were getting close to a point where there would be no more discussion left, only outcome. The courthouse didn't feel like the kind of place where big dramatic moments happen. It was actually quieter than I expected, almost ordinary, like the kind of building you'd walk past without ever realizing lives could change inside it. But that morning, everything felt heavier in a way I can't really explain, like even the silence had structure. Caleb sat across from me, looking different than the confident guy I first met over the fence months earlier. Not defeated exactly, but stripped of that easy certainty he used to have, the kind that made him think everything would bend around his decisions eventually. Our attorney started first, laying everything out in a very calm, methodical way. Original survey documents, updated certified measurements, photographic evidence showing the balcony extending beyond the property line. And then the timeline of construction that showed exactly when the encroachment happened and how it progressed despite written notice. There was nothing emotional about it, just structured evidence stacking one layer after another until the situation became impossible to interpret any other way. Caleb's lawyer tried to frame it as a design overhang, something minor, something negotiable. But the judge didn't really let that argument breathe. He made it clear early that property law doesn't work on visual impression or intent of design. It works on boundary lines, and those lines extend vertically, not just across the ground. The key turning point came when the contractor was called to testify. He wasn't defensive, just factual, almost tired, and he confirmed what had been recorded during discovery, that the boundary issue had been identified during framing flagged internally, and that Caleb had instructed them to continue anyway to avoid delays and additional cost. In the moment that was said out loud in that room, I could feel the entire case shift from dispute into deliberate violation. There was a pause after that testimony that felt longer than it actually was, like everyone in the room understood that the remaining arguments were just procedural at that point and not truly about uncertainty anymore. The judge didn't take long after that. The ruling was direct and unambiguous. The encroaching portion of the balcony had to be fully removed. No modification, no. Partial adjustment, no redesign compromise. Complete removal back within legal boundaries. And on top of that, Caleb was ordered to pay for legal fees, survey costs, and damages associated with the encroachment. There was no celebration in the courtroom. No moment of satisfaction like you see in movies. Just this quiet ending where a decision is made and everyone has to accept it and move on. But the real moment didn't happen in court. It happened weeks later when the crew came back to the property. I watched from my kitchen window as the same workers who had built the balcony originally returned with tools that weren't meant for building anymore. They started carefully dismantling it, section by section, railing first, then flooring, then the beams that had once extended so confidently over my backyard. It wasn't fast, it wasn't chaotic, it was methodical, almost respectful in its own way, like reversing a decision that should never have been made in the first place. And as each piece came down, I noticed something I didn't expect. The yard started to feel lighter, not physically, but mentally, like the space was returning to how it was supposed to feel. Caleb didn't come out much during the demolition, at least not when I was watching, but I did see him once standing near his back door, just observing it all. No anger, no argument, just stillness. Like he understood there was nothing left to challenge anymore. And when it was finally done, when the last part of the overhang was removed and everything was rebuilt within the proper boundary, my backyard looked the same as it did before all of this started, but it didn't feel the same because now I understood how quickly something can be taken not through force, but through assumption, and how much effort it takes just to return things to where they were supposed to be in the first place. And even now, I still think about it sometimes. Not out of anger, but out of this strange clarity, because it was never really about a balcony. It was about what happens when someone decides a boundary is optional. And I guess the question I still sit with is simple. If I had ignored it, if I had let those few feet slide just to keep the peace, where would it have ended? And that's something I don't think has an easy answer, so I'll leave it with you. What would you have done if you were standing in that yard and saw it happening in real time? I'd genuinely like to know how others see it, because situations like this always look simple from the outside until you're the one standing under the shadow. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and stick around, because every neighborhood has its lines, and not all of them stay respected.